You can now support Ghost Maps on Patreon and buy our official merchandise on Redbubble. Simply look for We Are HANTU or click the links in the description. Ghost Maps, Entry 24, East Coast Park, Singapore. I noticed David's tattoo as soon as he takes a seat across from me. We're at a coffee shop in Sengkang, a couple of blocks away from his flat, on a nice, sunny Saturday afternoon. David doesn't seem to think much of the weather though. I suppose it's just rose-tinted glasses, he says, with a shrug. The skies are never as clear as they used to be when you're a kid. David admits that his teenage years were probably no more special than most Singaporean kids back in the late 90s. Shopping for clothes at Far East Plaza, buying CDs at the old Tower Records, trying to sneak into clubs, and of course, school holidays spent at chalets. He laughs at how no one does that anymore. I don't want to sound like one of those old guys that goes on and on about what he used to do back in his day though. He chuckles. I take the opportunity to ask about the tattoo on his right forearm. It's of a mahjong tile, one of those on which a Chinese character has been engraved. I recognize the character as Dong or East. He tells me that it's actually connected to his story, which of course is my cue to turn on my recorder and ask him to start from the beginning. It was the December holidays back in 1998, and David and his friends were on the cusp of young adulthood. They'd all received their O-level results just a week earlier. Most of them would be furthering their education locally. Some of them had opportunities to study abroad. A couple of them were even planning to jump straight into work. All of them, however, knew that this school holiday was probably going to be one of their last times hanging out together, even if none of them wanted to say it out loud. So, they decided to mark the occasion by booking a chalet over at East Coast Park. There were 10 of them at the chalet, including David's two best friends, Hadi and Joe, as well as his girlfriend at the time, Melissa. They had booked the chalet for 5 days, the first 2 of which were relatively uneventful. Most meals were lightly charred fare, like chicken, satay or prawns, eaten off paper plates around the barbecue. Music was constantly playing, either from David's radio, or courtesy of someone strumming an off-key cover of Wonderwall on Joe's guitar. And there was always a game of mahjong going on. On the third night, David, Melissa, and 2 of their other friends, Samantha and Aaron, were in the middle of one of those games. It was around 1 in the morning, and no one had gone to bed yet. Hadi, Joe, and the rest of their friends were just chatting, mostly about their idealistic plans for the future. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until the chalet suddenly went cold. Not the kind of cold from a particularly chilly breeze or an air conditioner set too low, but almost like an overwhelming presence. Hadi was the first to notice and tried to adjust the fans, but it didn't seem to make a difference. That's when David realized that something was wrong with Melissa. She had stopped speaking mid-sentence and had gone completely pale. She tilted her head down and started mumbling to herself in what sounded like 2 different voices. But David couldn't make out what she was saying. Suddenly, her head shot back up, and something about her had completely changed, as if the lighting on her was all wrong. skin was sickly green and her eyes didn't seem to focus. And then she spoke. It was a voice that David didn't recognize, but swears to me that he'll never forget. It was still a woman, but she sounded older, much older. There was a hoarseness to her voice that simply couldn't have come from his usually soft-spoken girlfriend. She growled out a hello that got everyone's attention and stunned them into complete silence. Everyone, that is, except for Joe, who calmly but firmly asked this woman who she was and what she wanted. David would later find out that this wasn't Joe's first brush with the supernatural, but in that moment, David was in complete awe at his friend's bravery. The spirit, it seemed, was impressed too. In something almost approximating a friendly tone, she said, wearing an unsettling grin on Melissa's face, and she wanted to play mahjong. Joe told her that she had possessed their friend, and again, as politely as he could, that she was not welcome there. The spirit, however, simply replied, "Then make me leave." Joe didn't respond to her. Instead, he looked pleadingly around the chalet. Samantha and Aaron had already stepped away from the table. But if the spirit wanted to play, then it needed people to play with. David followed Joe's line of sight and saw what his friend did. That despite having their futures ahead of them, in that very moment, the reality was that they were all still children. Terrified children. Eventually, Hari stood up and, together with Joe, joined David at the mahjong table. David tells me that if the spirit had possessed anyone besides Melissa, he probably would have stepped away from the table too. I wasn't brave, he says, but I felt less scared with Hadi and Joe there. With her fellow players finally seated, the spirit reached out to the tiles in the center of the table. Before she started shuffling them, though, she said plainly, flashing that unsettling, ill-fitting grin again, that she didn't like to lose. The boys only nodded, as the sound of shuffled plastic tiles and hoarse laughter filled the chalet. They played for hours. Everyone who wasn't part of the game barely moved all night. One of the boys even wet himself, but still no one dared to make a sound. By 6:30, the spirit's side of the table was piled high with chips, which she looked upon proudly. It was around this time when the spirit suddenly let out a satisfied grunt, her voice more guttural than before, and then laid her head on the table. David, Joe, and Hadi were unsure of what was going on at first. But then David noticed that the chalet's fluorescent lights were now mixed with the warm rays of the sun shining through the windows. It was dawn. The spirit had left. Melissa rubbed the sleep from her eyes and asked what had happened. That morning, with 2 days remaining on their booking, the 10 friends packed up and left. For years after, I never went back to that area, David says. He knew that the whole stretch had been revamped in the early 2000s, and that all those familiar chalets were gone. When he finally decided to check out the area again a few years ago, it was a jarring experience for him. Certainly, though not entirely for the reasons he had expected. Standing there, watching as a whole new generation of teenagers whiled away their holidays, hopeful for the future that awaited them, he found himself filled with a mix of disorientation, that same sense of relief he had felt when that night came to an end, and a strange longing. A longing for when the skies always seemed clearer to him. A longing for barbecues and bad acoustic Wonderwall covers. And that's when I finally realized what David's tattoo means. It wasn't a reminder of his encounter. It was a reminder of his life before it. If you want to discover more of Southeast Asia's other side, subscribe now and follow us on social media at We Are HANTU. Ghost Maps is recorded on Audio Technica mics.